Okay. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. My name is Nick from Conservation Careers, and this is quite a special episode of the podcast, something I hadn't realised until just a few days ago when Kristi, my co-pilot here today, pointed out this is the 100th episode of the Conservation Careers podcast. We've been around for 5 years, just over. I've just been sort of chugging along, an episode every 2 or 3 weeks, something like that, over that period, talking to so many different people within the conservation sector, playing with the formats and enjoying the ride. And we thought we'd do a slightly different episode for episode 100, where we're a bit more reflective, really, looking back at the podcast so far, some of the lessons learned, some of the kind of the behind the scenes, how we pull it together, how we edit it, and sharing any hints or tips that maybe we've picked up along the way that if you're interested in doing your own podcast, you might be able to sort of take something away and start it for yourself, because it's super easy. I say we. Joining me is my partner in crime, Kristi. Hi, Kristi.
Hi, Nick. Hi, everyone. Nice to be on the podcast with you.
Yeah. We've done a few now together, haven't we? So, yeah, and we can talk about
that. A handful. Yeah, they've all been great.
They're always fun. It's a nice format to have, and that's what this is all about today, kind of talking about the kind of pod format. And I'm going to sort of hand over the reins to you a little bit. So you're our head of engagement at Conservation Careers. For people that don't know you, we've been working together now 4 or 5 years. You've hosted one podcast, which was quite fun on your own. And we've done quite a few kind of joint podcasts as part of happy hour communities with other people like Nando, our friend, and others. But in this episode, to be a bit more reflective, you're going to take the reins and you're going to sort of semi-interview me. So I'm going to chuck the mic your way.
Thank you.
There you go. It's all yours, and we'll see where this episode 100 goes.
Nice. Yeah, well, 100 episodes in 5 years. I just want to say that's a huge commitment and a huge accomplishment. And I'm really happy we were taking this episode to celebrate that and kind of reflect on it before we kind of dive into what's next.
Yeah, me too. And you've worked for Conservation Careers for 4 years, or is it 5 years now? I think it's almost about the same timescale.
4. Yeah, almost. You'd started it when I joined officially in 2019.
Right.
I don't remember what episode we were at then, but yeah, it is more or less the same timescale.
Yeah,
which is kind of neat.
Yeah.
I think we did an episode together after year 1 of the podcast in December of 2019.
Right.
Kind of say how it gone in the first year.
Yeah. Oh, I should have listened back to that. I'd forgotten about that. I scrolled down all the 100 or 99 episodes as it is today, just to remind myself of all those conversations. And there's a lot gone on in 99 episodes. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that was one of the early ones. Yeah. I mean, just for stats, actually, while we're kind of preambling. So 5 years old, we launched the 21st of June, 2018, and it's July 2023 right now. 152,136 unique downloads, I'm quite proud of that. That's quite nice. Yeah, with a typical episode gets around 1,500 to 2,000 listeners. But I think what I'm most proud of with the podcast so far is we've got 5-star ratings on Apple Podcasts. That's quite nifty. And we're also the top conservation podcast on Spotify. And I only really noticed that today. I just put conservation in, and we're kind of all over the place on that. We're the first one that shows up, and lots of episodes kind of streaming through. So I feel like sort of quietly, slowly but surely, it's sort of created like a little platform for itself, this kind of discussion piece that we've got.
Yeah, I think it's so cool too, because in a podcast format, people can listen to it anywhere. People can listen to the podcast out in nature.
Yeah.
Surrounded by nature and wildlife. That's pretty neat.
Yeah. If that's you should take the headphones off and listen to them now.
Yeah. Pop them back in.
And then pop them back in when nature stops calling. Yeah. Right. Though, what is nice about the format, I think, is that you do form a really deep connection, I think, with the listener. I listen to a lot of podcasts myself. If I'm running or walking or driving the car, long distances, that sort of stuff, it's brilliant for that. And I'll happily listen to sort of hours. And, if we put the same interview, which is what it is really, in a written form as a blog post on our website, which we do regularly, and that's where this started from, really. You can skim read that in a few minutes, and that's probably what most people do. That's what I do. I'd read a bit here, read a bit there, skim through, get the gist. Okay, that's fine, move on. Whereas a podcast, you're in someone's ear for 30, 40, 50 minutes.
Yeah.
And then listening, intently listening, and you sort of really get to know someone, I think, when you listen to a podcast, really. And it's that kind of nice relationship that's built.
Yeah, I was going to say that word relationship, it is like building a relationship. And I've heard another podcaster, I'm not sure who it was, say it. When you read a book or you listen to a podcast, it's almost like you feel like you have a relationship with that person who you've never met and may never have actually spoken to. So I think that's really neat. And yeah, you can't achieve that in a blog post in the same way.
No. And you're right. It's one of the few things you can do when you're doing something else. You can't read a book when you're driving a car or something, but this format works well. And what's great about it is that anyone can make a podcast nowadays. We're going to talk about that a bit later, I'm sure, but it's actually a really simple format. At the beginning, I was a bit baffled by how to set it up, how to edit, record, how do you share it? But actually it's easy. Anyone can do it. And it's just blown up the last, 10 years, podcasting has become huge.
Absolutely. Well, I guess given that, how did the story of the podcast start? What motivated you to start the podcast in the first place?
Yeah. Well, I think at the deepest level, I'm a kind of lazy individual, and I don't like to work harder than I need to. I really value efficiency in my world. I recognize there's probably like a clock ticking, and I want to make use of my time. And basically, Conservation Careers started off as a job board with like an interview blog, which is still something with foundations of who we are and what we do. So I spent a lot of time in the early days, speaking to people, recording Skypes, transcribing them, doing similar things that we're doing on the podcast, but, transcribing them and writing them up as a blog post. And, after a while of doing that probably for like 2, 3, 4 years, I was like, I've got all these audio recordings and podcasting is like a really big thing. Why don't I just share the audio recordings as podcasts, like do a bit of editing on them? And basically that's the format, it would work really well, this interview thing, in this podcast format. So it just kind of, it seemed like an obvious thing. And it also meant I didn't have to transcribe everything. It was much quicker and easier. Once you'd had the chat, it was mostly done. So, also podcasts were becoming more popular and still are, 5 years ago, they're obviously still a big thing. They've been around for, nearly 20 years now, but it was quite big back then. And it was obvious that it was something to kind of jump on and to sort of play with and experiment with. And it seemed like fun. And my approach was, I'll do it for 12 months. That's it. I'll do an episode every 2 weeks, for 12 months. And so 26 episodes, and we'll just see how that goes, really. And that was it. And I think 12 months just kind of came and went, and it just kind of, at no point did I stop and reflect. It just kept going. I just organically enjoying it. I was having these conversations anyway. Why not share them? Why not kind of get them out there? Why not, create a new channel for us, for kind of talking to our audience? We've got a website, we've got an email list, we've got our social media channels. A podcast is a really interesting format. Let's try that too. Yeah. And so it just started that way and has kind of kept going ever since, really.
Yeah. I get the sense it's just a ton of fun. You deeply enjoy a lot of these conversations that you get to have with people. And I know sometimes you told me you've come out of a podcast recording and it's like you've connected with a best friend, someone who you just get on so well with that you almost forget it's a podcast recording.
100%. That's happened loads. Yeah. And actually, when I look back at the episodes, I've interviewed quite a few friends on the podcast, like people I've known and been close to for years. And I've always wanted to kind of talk to them about their careers or share their stories. And it's given us a platform to do that. I mean, I did that last week with Niall McCann, who's just been on, I think, probably the previous episode. I've known him for a few years. His brother is a best friend of mine. And, there's lots of examples of that, of people that, I'd love to share this person with the world, so we get them on the podcast. And then other people almost like strategically reached out to, because I'd love to get to know them a bit better. And sort of, networking, talked about this before. I don't like the word networking, but it's definitely making friends, and that's what podcasting does. You have an hour's conversation with that individual about their work, and if you're truly interested, which I know both of us are, when we talk to people about their jobs, then at the end of that, you feel like you've connected at quite a fun sort of deep level, really, and that connection stays. So a number of times people that we've reached out to for an interview, we've had a great connection, a podcast, whatever, and now we're in touch quite regularly for lots of different reasons and different purposes, and they introduce us and we introduce them, and the kind of the net gets cast wider. It's fantastic for that. It always feels like there's a thing on UK radio called Desert Island Discs. I don't know if you know that in Canada, maybe not. Yeah,
I've not heard of it. No.
It's been going for 50, 60 years or something. It's a huge thing. And basically people of impact, I guess, within society, not all celebrities, are interviewed about their lives and their careers, and they pick musical choices that depict different elements of their life, and at the end they get cast off onto this desert island, this mythical desert island, and they have to choose which music they'll take with them, that sort of stuff. And it's basically a chat about their life. That's all it is. Yeah. Really popular, been going for years, hundreds of episodes. David Attenborough's been on it 3 or 4 times, as have many other people. And this is kind of like our little version of that without the music. We just talk about people's lives, and everyone likes talking about their lives, so it's quite fun.
And people's stories are fascinating,
Yeah,
just fascinating. 40 minutes is never enough to even scratch the surface, I think, of what people have to share. But
I feel like more and more as well, actually. Nowadays I feel like I'm watching the clock a lot and thinking I've got to wrap this up, but I'd love to let it run, but I'm quite respectful. I've got an hour of someone's time, and they might have something to go to afterwards, and mm-hmm. But like Josh Rogan, who's like the biggest podcaster in the world, he goes on for 3, 4, 5 hours, doesn't he? So that long is quite popular nowadays.
Yeah, there's a few podcasters that do that. And I remember hearing, it's so that the person who's being interviewed gets kind of past the barrier, and it becomes a really open conversation an hour or so in.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. I go fishing quite a bit when I get a chance, and that is a time when I listen to quite long form podcasts. I can just sit it next to me and it'll run for 2 or 3 hours. I don't need to think about it. It's like I've got a friend sat next to me chatting away, and it works really well. Yeah,
I do that when I'm cycling. It's great.
Yeah.
So Nick, do you have a favorite or most memorable episode or episodes?
There's a bunch. Yeah, it's like choosing your favorite child, isn't it? You shouldn't do it. But 99 episodes. I did look back earlier and trying to think, what stands out for me. And there's a few, and I'll sort of rattle through a few. I think the first episode is memorable just for being the first episode. So I interviewed my old boss at BirdLife, Patricia Zarita, who's an amazing lady, charismatic CEO of BirdLife International. Sort of worked with alongside in various guises for a year or 2 before I left BirdLife and did conservation careers. And she kindly agreed to being on the first episode. So I went to her office and, sort of sat down and, recorded it face to face, and a bit nervous, but it went really well. And I really enjoyed that moment, and a very different interaction with someone than I've had previously. It's quite a sort of different vibe. So that was memorable. It's also the most listened to episode. I was looking today, which maybe just reflects it's episode number 1. It's been around the longest. I don't know, but yeah. And interestingly, she's moving on. That's in the public domain. She's moving to a different job soon. So I thought about reconnecting with her again and just seeing 5 years on what's changed, because I'm sure I asked her, where do you see BirdLife in 5 years' time? So it'd be quite fun to kind of go back and say, what happened? Let's talk about the reality of it and all that sort of stuff. So Patricia's one. Other memorable people, I mean, there's also other people at kind of really senior level at some of the big NGOs. They've been really memorable chats. So I'm thinking Mike Clark was the previous chief executive of the RSPB, one of the biggest conservation charities on the planet. Becky Spate is the new CEO, been in place a number of years. I'd like to chat to her as well. She's on my hit list. Mark Rose, again, he was chief executive of Fauna and Flora International. I believe he's moving on or has moved on. Both Mike and Mark were just fantastic interviewees. I went to both their offices, which was nice to do it sort of face to face, and their career stories and their advice And I remember bumping into, actually, at the very beginning, 5 years ago, the previous CEO of BirdLife International. And I sort of said, I'm doing a podcast because we don't need to speak to people at the senior level. You want to share careers advice. You want to talk to people who have just secured their first job, like early career professionals. This is Mike Rands. And it's always been in the back of my mind, is it better to speak to people at the top or speak to people at the bottom? And I've done both and everything in between, I guess, over 100 episodes. And I've enjoyed all of them. But actually, the really memorable ones are the people who have had quite long established careers and can really kind of reflect from a different perspective. And Patricia, Mike Clark, Mark Rose, like I've mentioned, they've all been at that level and they've been great, really good chats. Other ones that stand out as well, again, keeping it brief, again, like an old boss of mine. So when I left uni, a guy called Professor David Hill really sort of set up the ecological consultancy scene here in the UK and has been a figurehead for many years around that. And we had a really interesting chat that I still think about regularly, about his approach to securing new finance for biodiversity, for landscape rewilding projects, and taking money from developers, securing money from developers and paying for conservation programs, essentially. And it still excites me to this day, the kind of the direction that he's taking and the potential for what he's doing. So that chat with David Hill really stands out as a kind of, something that opened my eyes to something that I hadn't quite, seen previously. And again, nice guy. And then just connecting to lots of people. I think, 99 episodes, old friends on my list in front of me, like Andrew Cottam at Restore. Ben Sullivan working on albatross work. Niall McCann, mentioned the other day, he was on the podcast just a few days ago. Mark Anderson, CEO at BirdLife South Africa. Alistair Harris, these are just old friends really, who's running Blue Ventures, and Nirmal Shah, who runs Nature Seychelles too, and Fernando Mateus Gonzalez. I think can't not mention Nando, who's been on a number of our episodes. That's just, a bunch of people out of 99, but there's so much in there, and so many interesting chats, but they all stand out to me.
Yeah. I love that idea of interviewing someone, asking them what it's going to be like in 5 years' time, and then going back and having a follow-up interview to see what happened. I think that's fascinating.
Wouldn't it be great? I should do it. Yeah. Because we're sort of at that point now where you could sort of cycle back to the 5-year thing. I mean, I interviewed just yesterday Tara Phillips, who we both know pretty well, to share her story of transition. And she's starting to explore creating a new thing called the Soil Centre. And you'll hear about that quite soon. And the idea there is episode 1. I did the same with Ed Sanders as well, who we're really close to at the moment. And early transitions. They're mid-career, but they're transitioning into conservation. And so the idea is, let's have a chat now, see where you are, what you're doing. And then at some point in the future, it could be 6 months, it could be a year or whenever, I'd love to circle back and do a part 2 and see what happened, what changed, and sort of share that journey. So not just like sharing the success at the end, sharing the transition and the plans and the reality. Yeah. And that's, I guess that's something else that's really important to us in conservation careers, and certainly in the podcast, is we're not looking to polish or glorify conservation as this, panacea, perfect career that everyone would thrive in and enjoy. We're just here to share the transparent, warts and all honesty of the jobs and the roles. And that's really important, So we say, what are the good bits? What are the bad bits? What do you want to share, And so people can understand the breadth and different things that people are working on and different roles, but also hopefully see it from an honest perspective, that it's not perfect and no sector is.
Yeah. I think the word perspective kind of stands out, because that idea of interviewing someone at the early stages of their career or at the later stages of their career, from quite junior to quite senior, the perspective, I imagine, is really different. And I'm guessing there's a huge amount of value, for someone who's just starting out, to see what it looks like just at the next step, the next stage, getting over that hurdle of getting your foot in the door. But also hearing from someone who's looking back at a career that may have been a decade or two or more, and what they've seen shift and change, and what's like really stood out to them in that period of time. I think that's so neat to get the perspectives across all of that.
Yeah. It's so true. Yeah. And also, I guess, the perspectives of different cultures and backgrounds. Yeah. That's what we do try our best to interview people from anywhere and everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
We do have an ambition to speak to someone from every country and territory on the planet and sort of share those stories. And it's going to
Yeah.
be a long strive, but we'll keep going. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think it is important to kind of share, different, the full diversity, the breadth of different types of conservationists that are out there, so people can see themselves, and connect with that. Again, on the podcast, so much jumps out from the podcast for me. Like just the other day, I was speaking to Elizabeth Stevenson from the New England Aquarium, episode coming very soon, and she mentioned a few amazing things, but one, she was talking about equity, diversity, inclusion. It's an important thing that everyone's aware of nowadays and working on. And she said that someone she works closely with, I forget their name, mentioned that, let me get this exactly right. Yeah, she said talent is evenly distributed across the planet, but opportunity is not.
Mm.
And that was so clear and succinct, about the barriers to inclusion within the sector. I've never thought about it or heard it said as clearly as that before. And I know it's something that we want to do more of in CC, and put like that, why, how can you not? I mean, she's absolutely right.
I love that. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think especially having sort of worked, or well, you have too, you've worked in other parts of the world. We both have. And the people you meet across so many different cultures, and just the passion and the knowledge and the dedication and the talent is incredible, and it's everywhere. And yeah, sometimes we just see the tip of the iceberg, and there's so many people out there that, given the opportunity to share their voice, would have a huge impact. So
yeah,
I love that. Yeah. And I
and
hope
actually
we
that's
can
one
keep
thing that's nice.
expanding that.
Sorry, Kristi. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
One thing that's nice about the podcast is, we do try and share different voices. We could always do better, for sure. But it is free. Anyone could listen to it, and everything that's on here is freely available, shareable. And we try and share as much good advice as possible. And that's always a kind of key part of what we do. So, I mean, the three areas that I always think about when coming into a conversation with someone is, let's talk about your work right now, your role, your job, the organization, the project, the program, whatever your world is, from a professional perspective right now, and share as much of that as we can. Then look back at the career journey. What have been the steps, the milestones, what's led you to where you are? It often feels really squiggly as you're kind of going through your career, and can look quite straight line when you're looking backwards, if you like. But that's really telling. Like, how did you get to where you are? And then really it's about advice. Like, what have you learned along that journey? What advice would you give people, whether students, job seekers, career switchers, or professional conservationists? More and more we're speaking to professional conservationists, and sort of hearing that advice, that's really nice. So those are the themes that are in my mind, and it all connects together largely quite smoothly, I think, when we have a good conversation around those topics.
Yeah. So you've got kind of a format within the episode, but I know that the podcast has changed, between episode 1 and, well, here we are today, episode 100. How has it changed and shifted, and what have you done differently in that time? Yeah,
I mean, change is part of who we are, again, at CC. Like, we're agile, we learn, we adapt, we shift, we fail, we succeed, and everything else. So it's always an experiment, I think, the podcast. And today is a good example of that. We've not done an episode quite like this before, and happy to try it. It started off as quite a structured interview, where I would have questions written down, and I wouldn't necessarily work through them, but they were there, and I wanted to try and address as many as possible. So that with Patricia, that episode 1, that's probably what I did. And I probably spend quite a lot of time editing as well. I come back, and the first dozen or more episodes were me finding sound bites, putting them at the beginning of the podcast as a sort of teaser to what's going to come later. Removing any ums and ahs and ers and that sort of stuff in the edit, and really trying to polish something and put something out there that was as good as it could be. I think over time that's become much more relaxed, My editing process is really rough and ready nowadays, and it might come across as that, I don't know, but just from an honesty speed perspective, I think that's really important. I mean, right now we're talking as you would with friends, and I'm not cutting out any ers and ahs. It just happens. It's this conversation. So I think we just keep that in nowadays. Format wise, mostly it's been one-to-one interviews, and we'll probably still be that way. We've done a number of like happy hours, which I think have been really fun. That's been quite a nice format, which has been myself and often Nando, and yourself, Kristi, or we've had Stephanie Shuttler as well, as kind of, guest hosts. And that's just more of an open conversation, three people just talking about what's going on and, what's interesting to us at that time, or diving into a specific topic in a bit more depth than we would normally through a kind of one-to-one interview. And that's I've enjoyed that format a lot, and we'll do more of that, I'm sure. We sort of missed that. We've not done it for a while, but it's just because we've been doing other stuff and busy. We should definitely restart that. We have, again, looking back at the 99 episodes, we've done a number of like webinar recordings that we've released as podcasts. I think that's been quite good. It's about repurposing content really for us. We have this really valuable content. We ran a webinar or something. Let's put it out to our podcast listeners too, because it works well in that format as well. Yeah. So we've done one on CVs and applications, women in conservation. Kristi, you'll remember that well. Career switcher panel. Did a career challenge as well, like New Year, different format. And something that I'm enjoying a lot, actually, that we've done the last couple of months, like literally just started the last 4 or 5 episodes, something like that, is actually inviting people in from our audience, from our membership, really, our community, to come and listen into the recordings like an audience on the podcast. So the last few recordings, we've had 4, 5, 6 people sort of listening in. They sit there quietly, cameras off, microphones off. We have a normal conversation, myself and the interviewee. And then at the end, we finish the recording, and then they can unmute, turn back on, and talk and interact with the guests themselves. That's been really good. I've loved that. Yeah, and just watching that, I can sort of sit back and just watch them interact. And I feel like we've connected, 2 different audiences, and they really value that. Again, that's about efficiency and laziness as much as anything for me, is that we've done both formats. So we had what we still call like pro chats. So in our community, we invite professionals in, and then we invite our community to ask them questions, a bit like a podcast. And they were fun and they worked okay. But what I often felt in that format was a lot of the interaction, at least at the beginning, was either myself as the host or yourself, Kristi, in getting that conversation going, trying to put people at their ease, encourage people to ask their own questions. And that took quite a while. And after a while, I thought, this is almost like a podcast where I'm sort of asking all the same questions that I would in a podcast. And I'm doing a lot of the conversation at the beginning as people become really comfortable to then interact, engage themselves. Why not just merge the 2 formats, so they can sit in on the recording. I'll have that conversation. We'll do the podcast. And then they ask questions at the end, having kind of, relaxed into it fully and are ready to kind of engage. And it's worked brilliantly. Yeah, it's really, really fun, and quite a nice format to be playing with, and we'll do more and more of that. I like it. Yeah,
I think it's genius. And I think I didn't realize when you first talked about starting that format of sort of having a live audience and having people ask questions at the end, I don't think I realized how useful that would be for people to network and engage. Because I think that it feels like there's a barrier, between professional conservationist over here and, a career switcher, someone who's starting out in their career, looking to make their next transition or move. And I think there really is, it does feel sometimes like there's a huge barrier. You can't make these connections with these people or talk to them. And that totally breaks it down in a way that's super fun and comfortable.
Yeah.
I just love that.
It really does. Yeah. And it's interesting, the people that turn up in the audience are the people that I'm confident are really making things happen for themselves. Like, we're creating this opportunity. They come in and make the most of that opportunity, ask questions. They're really interested and engaged. And it shows, actually. I mean, also, I've said it a bunch of times, but conservation is we're kind of a friendly community, really, like a family almost. I don't think anyone's turned me down for a podcast yet. One has. One.
Who
So
was
David
it?
Attenborough.
I was going to guess.
I
Yeah.
tried. I got a letter from him, which was very kind. I wrote
Oh,
to
wow.
him. I got a letter back, very politely letting me down. He must have 1,000 requests like that every day. Of course, it's a long shot, but largely, by and large, people are really happy to share their time and answer questions and to connect with people in the audience. And yeah, and we should definitely keep doing more and more of that sort of stuff. Yeah. And I'd love to hear from anyone. Like if people have got guests in mind that they'd like us to chat to, then we could bring them in and create that forum that they could also engage with, and sort of, create a stage for it.
Yeah. Suggestions welcome.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So I'm imagining that we have a lot of people in our community ecosystem audience who have either started a podcast or they're thinking about starting a podcast. You mentioned, you might share a bit about what it's like for people who want to do their own.
Yeah.
How do you actually, what are the nuts and bolts of the podcast? How does it work? How is it organized?
Yeah.
How do you put it together?
Yeah, I think it's a nice thing to talk about because I've definitely seen more of an interest in it. And I've heard people say, I'd love to do a podcast, but I don't know how, or I'm a bit scared of doing it. And I get that 100%, but I see it's quite straightforward. And I think the workflow, if you like, now is quite slick and straightforward from our side. So like finding guests, starting from that perspective, for us, it's quite natural. We're connected with people all day long in different ways, and they sort of tend to sort of find themselves. Like Elizabeth Stevenson, I just spoke to about the the New England Aquarium. She was someone who signed up some of her students for one of our courses, and just a quick look, and you realize doing really interesting things. And I'd love to speak to her and find out more about that. Just that sort of inquisitiveness. So guests are fairly straightforward. There's no shortage of guests out there. And there never will be. And a lot of it is people we know or introductions and people that just come across us. So that's straightforward. So just scheduling a time and a date to chat is all it is, using Zoom. We're on Zoom right now, just recording the Zoom. That's it. Nothing fancy about that. I think having a good mic really helps. So I've got a reasonable mic here, but again, I bought it 5 years ago and it was probably 40 quid then. So it's more than paid for itself, and a half decent camera. But the mic's the key thing. Like have a good mic if you're going to be a host, I think, because it does make a bit of a difference. But once it's done, it's done. Preparation for the podcast, I used to do a lot more, and now I'm getting much more relaxed about it, I guess. I found myself more and more literally 10 minutes before the episode going, oh, right, I better prepare for this. And I think it's a deliberate thing to really focus in and almost instill like a little bit of panic in myself to quickly process information and get myself really quickly up to speed, but not be over prepared. I think there is a risk if you're over prepared for a conversation that you're not fully in the conversation, that you're sort of thinking about everything else you thought of and read and you want to ask and all that sort of stuff. Whereas more and more enjoying just letting the conversation take the direction it wants to take and staying with it. Yeah. So over preparing can keep you away from that, and it makes it less natural. But yeah, literally 10 minutes is what I do. I jump to their website, I jump to their LinkedIn profile, I get a good feel of the organization, who they are. Pretty quickly from that, you can do quite a lot quite quickly. And then in you go, really. Bit of a pre-chat with them on Zoom, make sure everyone's happy, they understand what we're doing. I ask them to start the record. I hit the recorder and then say, we're going to start. If you can just say your name and your job title, literally a sentence, because from that we can have the conversation. So I always find it quite hard to, how do you start? I edit the introduction on afterwards. So we have the conversation. I'm Nick from Conservation Careers. Nice to meet you, Nick. And then in you go, you're off. You're away at the races. And so the conversation happens naturally. Keep an eye on the clock. And then afterwards, I quite quickly write my introduction, again, really quick and dirty, and then record that introduction because I know what we've just talked about. So I do it afterwards. It helps me sort of tease into it. And we have a standard outro, if you like, the thing at the end that says, please like and subscribe and that sort of stuff. So then it's really into the edit. And the edit is, I use Camtasia, which is a kind of editing software, video editing, but you can export audio too. So it works fine. We do share to YouTube nowadays as well. So we keep the video file too, again, just using what we have and sort of repurposing. And the edit is very simple. It's just the intro that I've written, spoken to camera, music that we have, and a little title thing that we have that was super quick and cheap and easy. Just music from copyright-free music provider. And the titles were made using something called Freelancer, I think it was, like an online thing that creates your little, introduction graphic stuff. Plonk in the episode, crop to the beginning and the end. Little outro that I use the same every time, pretty much, and we're done. It's kind of done. So I think the recording the episode lasts less than an hour, and the preparation, the editing time is way less than an hour as well. So it's probably 2 hours, all in. No real editing in the middle, unless there was something in that conversation that, for whatever, a dog barked, or I don't know, I spilled my coffee or whatever. There might be something I might want to edit out, but 9 times out of 10, there's nothing to edit out. That conversation was fine. We're all happy with it, Yeah. And it's basically in there. And really, I then hand over to you, Kristi, at that point. And I sort of say, there's a podcast episode, sat in your Dropbox that we share. You then upload to our host, which is Libsyn, which is it's $18 a month, £14. I was looking today. So not insignificant, but doesn't cost a huge amount. You can probably find something a bit cheaper as well. But that's sort of probably £5-10 a month is about what it is. Published to YouTube. And what Libsyn does quite nicely is it sends it across to all the different channels and providers. It syndicates to Apple Podcast, to Spotify, to Castbox, to whatever, So that's it really. Once you've got your audio edited, you just upload it to this one place, and it then sends it everywhere and kind of broadcasts it out. So that whole piece is quite straightforward. So a good mic, edit using Camtasia, send it out using Libsyn. Done. It's really, so it looks complicated if you read around it, but it's really not.
Yeah. I can imagine, the pressure if you're just starting and you're recording your first episode to get everything right and put it all together perfectly. And I kind of like that you talk about, you call it laziness. I wouldn't call it laziness, but efficiency, and simplicity, and just do it. And the fact that it's not totally rehearsed.
Yeah, I think that helps. I think you can play with the format a lot too. I mean, we have a format we sort of settled into and it works for us, but there's 1,000 different formats you could have that could be really fun. I could imagine a format where you go for a walk, either on your own or with someone you're interviewing or talking to.
Yeah.
And just, and record it in quite a different setting, in a different way. And you can have the birds and the nature and whatever. There's lots of different ways in which you could play with it. Yeah. And maybe we will experiment.
Having the same thought.
Yeah. Maybe we'll experiment a bit more with it. But it's not difficult. Anyone can do it. Yeah. And it's quick, easy, cheap. And I think my only advice is that don't overthink it. It doesn't have to be perfect at all.
Yeah.
Good enough is good enough, and get it out there and just try and create an idea of what you want to do and just make it happen. And if no one listens, it doesn't matter. You don't even have to share it if you don't like it, but just give it a go.
Yeah. I love that. I was just talking to someone the other day who's describing an artist who creates art but doesn't share it. Just creates art for the sake of creating art. You learn a lot in the process, but obviously you're doing it and we're doing it, so we can share that insight and advice with people who want to get started in conservation, make the most of their careers. So there's an element of getting it out there in the world as widely as we can.
Tara, who I mentioned before, interviewed yesterday. She said something also, which is feel the fear and do it anyway.
I love that. Yes.
Recognize you're scared about something, acknowledge it, and then say, I'm going to do it anyway.
Because you could choose not to, or you could just go ahead.
Exactly.
So if you were if you yourself now, Nick, could go back and tell yourself 5 years ago something about the podcast, is there anything else you'd tell yourself as advice?
I think at the very beginning, don't agonize about perfection and polishing and editing and all that sort of stuff. Probably for the first couple of 3 years, that whole process of having recorded it took a lot more effort than it does now.
Yeah.
For a lot of time, I used to send it off to an editor, and they would do some of the editing, polish it up, make it sound better, send it back to me. I'd then send it to a transcriber. They would then transcribe it, and so on and so forth. We don't bother with any of that nowadays. Yeah, it just felt like we didn't need to do that. So just keep it simple. It's a bit of a mantra anyway. Just try and keep it really simple, whatever you do. And this is, I think that's probably what I'd say to myself. Yeah, I think maybe I should, and this is probably a lesson now really, is to be a bit more, well, I hate the word like strategic, like a bit more planned as in terms of what the episodes are. It's very organic. We don't really have a fortnightly structure. It depends whether I've managed to, organize an interview or not really. But I could, probably sit down and make a bit of a hit list of people I'd like to speak to, and then try and reach out to them. It's much more being about who's been in front of me at any one time that I would quite like to speak to, along with a few people that maybe I've reached out to, but I've not done much proactive. It's been very reactive. So I should probably, maybe I should try Sir David again before it's too late, because I think he turned 96 2 days ago or something like that. I'm not saying anything, but I'd love to chat to him. And there are definitely other people I think I'd like to speak to too, still, that I'd like to share their stories. Yeah.
Who's on your hit list?
Oh man, I knew you were going to follow up with that one. Genuinely, Niall McCann, who I spoke to like a few days ago, has been on my hit list. Just he's been described as the modern day Indiana Jones, and it's a good description. He really is. He just turns up to national parks and walks in the door and said, "I'd like to help, manage this park for you," and off he goes in Africa. Interesting work. Who else would I like to speak to? Well, I mentioned, the current CEO of RSPB, Becky Spate. I'd love to speak to her. Yeah, I think that should have some interesting kind of careers advice to share. And again, like a lady in a really senior position like that, I think it's really good to hear her story and how she got where she is. Who else is potentially on the kind of the hit list? Yeah. I'm not sure at the moment. I'll have to wait and see. Some more names will dribble out in due course, but yeah.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because it's in some ways so organic and natural, and it's just building relationships with people, and that just, it happens in the course of, CC and work and meeting people and interacting. So it makes a lot of sense just to have it flow.
Yeah.
But I kind of like the idea of a hit list too. I think it'd be really cool to talk to, like we were talking earlier about different perspectives and diversity, and Indigenous conservation leaders, and just some of the very different perspectives of conservation. Really cool.
Yeah, it would. Really, it's like, who has got a really good story to tell? Yeah, you don't have to be senior or, a celebrity or whoever, just what's the story of the work you're doing and the career you're involved with. And there's a thousand fascinating stories out there. It's just sort of identifying them. And where do you start? I mean, sometimes it might be a good start at the project that people are working on, find out about a really interesting project or an achievement or a challenge or whatever, and then discover the people involved in that program and talk to them specifically about it. I think that's what jumped out of that David Hill discussion I mentioned earlier, where they're sort of finding new ways of funding biodiversity. The story under all that is just fascinating. And maybe I should start more from that perspective. What are the big issues that we're trying to tackle? Okay, what are some of the projects, programs that are really kind of moving the needle? Who are behind them? Let's talk to them.
Yeah.
Who would you speak to, Kristi, if you could? Who's on your hit list?
Oh gosh, you can probably guess. I don't have necessarily all the names. Maybe I have a couple names. I'm really always fascinated by like sustainable tourism and ecotourism, and especially the Amazon.
Yeah.
So one name that comes to mind is Paul Rosalie. He's worked in in a very adventurous way in conservation in the Amazon, in South America. And Another name that comes to my mind is Lynn Twist. I don't know if you know her, other than I mentioned one of her books.
Yeah.
Like fundraised for hunger for years, but then later in her career, she shifted or expanded and led something called the Pachamama Alliance, which also works with like indigenous communities in the Amazon,
Yeah.
protecting parts of the Amazon. And she just has a really fascinating story. So I think
No.
on the story theme, they'd both be neat. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, and just different perspectives. Like I think I'd talk to also indigenous leaders in the conservation movement
Yeah.
if language wasn't a barrier, because obviously we're kind of limited by doing the podcast in English.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that puts some limits on it. But
Yeah.
yeah, I
Well,
don't
maybe we
know.
should do a Spanish language podcast or something, and go
None would
in
like
that
that.
direction. Yeah. 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 That could be fun.
Yeah.
Two other names jump to my mind as we're talking as well. One would be actually husband and wife, like is Isabella Tree, who's well known for her
Yeah.
rewilding book, or Wilding, I think it's called,
Yeah.
about the work that she's done on her family estate with her husband Charlie Burrell, at NEP, yeah, here in the UK. Incredible. I mean, it's one of many rewilding projects, I'm sure, but just the work and the achievement in a very short space of time to turn a formal agricultural landscape back to a sort of semi-wild state, and the species that returned.
Mm-hmm.
It's inspiring. Yeah, it really is. I mean, again, when I worked for BirdLife, and it's still a big topic of work is like migratory bird declines and flyways, migratory paths of birds and that sort of stuff. And a species of bird here in the UK is like a turtle dove that has just vanished from the skies in the last 10, 20 years. I mean, my wife, I used to go to her parents' house and there were turtle doves kind of calling in the field, and I've not heard them for 8, 9 years now. And it's just typical across the UK.
Yeah.
And the feeling was, and I think the story was, I used to write, stories about this at BirdLife, was they're facing a lot of threats on their migratory routes, which they are undoubtedly: hunting, desertification of North Africa, and so on. But at NEP, they've got so many turtle doves. Like, turtle doves are just like flourished and come back in great numbers quite quickly. And it is huge. Like, the hope around that for me is enormous. Like, gosh, it sort of shows that it's not just problems over there, to put it bluntly. We can solve a lot of problems here and species can come back. And actually, maybe it's a lot about there isn't enough food here in this landscape in the UK, and
Yeah.
insect declines and all that sort of stuff. And actually nature bounces back really quickly if you just sort some of the kind of parameters out. So that sparked huge interest in so many people rewilding. And Isabella and Charlie, husband and wife, they've done some inspiring work. And I'm lucky enough to have spoken to Charlie, a few times now in various ways. I'd love to get him on the podcast. That could be really fun. Yeah. And the other name that jumps to mind too is, I guess, a very old friend of mine and a mentor of mine, a guy called Craig Rolston, who not many people will have heard of, but he's a site manager for the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and my best friend at uni. And it's because of him I'm in conservation. Yeah, so I lived with him for 4 or 5 years, and he was managing 3 or 4 national nature reserves. And basically I spent more time in his Land Rover than I did at university in lecture theatres. And, and he's still doing the job that he was doing, 20 years ago. I mean, he's a bit more senior now and, more influential, but he is a proper sort of dyed-in-the-wool conservationist, birder, naturalist, like old school, amazing guy. So it'd be good to kind of get him on, talk about, his kind of very practical land management, career and advice.
Yeah. Something that jumps to my mind too is like, especially since you recently interviewed Edward and Tara, who are both career switchers, talking to more people who've switched their careers.
Yep.
Because I think like we see so much interest in that, like growing massively. And I think that's in some ways what's next for the conservation industry also, is more talent coming in from outside of the sort of traditional route. And we need to get some of those stories more of those stories on the podcast, which we've already started.
I agree. Yeah. And almost every conversation I've had with like the senior management type level conservationists talk about the need for more talent from outside the industry coming in. There are jobs for switchers. The industry's changing. We need to be better at communicating. These are all regular themes. And we see it ourselves, absolutely. And there's a huge groundswell of people interested in working conservation, but not knowing where to start or how to do it. So sharing the stories of people that have done it successfully. Yeah. We've done it a few times, but you're right. We should do it more. Yeah.
Yeah. So in 5 years, we'll be looking back at this conversation.
Yeah.
And where the podcast has gone.
How it's changed. Yeah. We'll just be an AI bot by
then. Maybe.
Yeah. Actually, I used AI a few times, but I used it to create like podcast titles and stuff like that recently, just try and speed stuff up. Again, efficiency, laziness. Here's my notes from the podcast, create me 10 different potential titles. Yeah. And number 3 looks quite good, it's great. Loads of opportunities for doing that, more that sort of stuff.
I love that. Yeah. It sparks creativity for us.
Yeah.
Was there anything else you want to say about the podcast?
Well, I was thinking, I guess, what next, really, thinking 5 years looking back, but 5 years looking forward, like what's going to change or what might we go with it? Definitely want to keep it going just because I enjoy it. Just it's that simple. It's good fun. I want to have these chats anyway, and we might as well share and record them, and we're sort of in a groove, and it's working for us as well. I'd like to get the happy hour back as a thing, and do a few more of those kind of more informal chats like we're having now, but even better when we have a sort of 3-way dynamic and get into a topic that's really fun. I hate to say it, but I'm kind of interested in sponsorship for the podcast. At no point have we ever used it for sort of business monetary gain, let's put it that way. But obviously it's a platform where we could potentially have a sponsor, I think, come in and either sponsor an episode or, just flat out, sponsor the podcast or something like that. I recognize that might change things, but that's something I think we're all very accepting of when we listen to podcasts nowadays. And, I think we might explore that ourselves and see if we couldn't find a sponsor. That could be really fun. If not, we're sponsoring our own podcast anyway. Obviously we talk about our memberships and our courses sometimes, but I think there's an opportunity to do a bit of that. And I think a greater involvement of the audience in the podcast. So having the questions, having suggested guests, people maybe asking questions in advance or something like that. I'm not sure how that would work. But again, we've had the audience in a few times recently. It's been really fun. And I've often thought afterwards, like, I'd love to have recorded the questions from the audience and the discussion that kind of came about as a result of that. Obviously, with permission, setting that up in advance right now, very much the ground rules are we're going to turn the mics off and then you can chat. So it's more relaxed. But I'd like to explore actually keeping the mics on and including that in the podcast if we can. Because the questions are great, the interaction's great, and it's a different dynamic again, and something I haven't really heard on podcasts either before, and I think it works well for us. So we'll keep going, we'll keep expanding, and who knows, different language, maybe different hosts. You've hosted an episode, it doesn't have to be the Nick Show, it's Conservation Careers, so I'm happy to keep sort of playing with what feels best, really. But it'll keep going. I
love the focus on I think what I'm thinking is that all the juicy stuff happens when it's unplanned, so the idea of like opening up that dialogue when you turn the mics off and you've got guests in the audience and people can just have a conversation and ask questions. It's pretty fun because you never know where that conversation is going to go.
No, absolutely. And if you can get people into the right dynamic and they're relaxed and comfortable with that setting, it can be really, quite a fruitful chat, quite fun.
Amazing. Well, 100 episodes, 5 years. How does it feel?
Job done. No, good. Really good. I was saying just beforehand, I'm in a happy mindset too, because straight after this recording, I'm going to go and pack for holiday. Me and the kids and the wife were all off away for sort of 10 days. So it's quite a nice moment to have got to, really. I'm happy to share this. And thank you to anyone in the audience listening. Thanks to you, Kristi, also just for, for supporting the podcast, for listening. It's funny when you record these things that you sort of forget there's more than just us two. There are other people. An average episode gets, I think I was saying before, like 1,500, 2,000 people. And if you can visualize that as like a conference or a small stadium or whatever, actually it's big. So yeah, thank you to everyone for listening. And if you have been kind enough to leave a rating or review, I've said it 100 times now. We really do appreciate it. We really do read them, and it really does help us to kind of spread our message. So yeah, big thanks to everyone listening.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. This has been fun.
Can't
wait to see where it is in 5 years.
Yeah. 5 years older.
Yeah.
Perhaps 5 years wiser. Well, till then, thanks again, everyone, for listening. And thank you also, Kristi. You've been a great co-host.
My pleasure.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that, everyone. If you did, then please do hit the subscribe button to get notified of new episodes as they drop. And also, please give us a rating or a review, because it really helps us to get in front of more people, and we really enjoy reading them all. As you'll have heard, our podcasts are now recorded in front of a live audience who sit in and listen to the chat, and then after the mics are turned off, they get a chance to talk to the host, to share their thoughts, and also to ask questions. It's a really great format. If you'd like to be in the audience, all you need to do is join the Conservation Careers Academy. Now, in the Conservation Careers Academy, you'll get full access to the world's biggest conservation job board, listing over 15,000 jobs, volunteer and internships across the globe each year. You'll also enjoy access to our amazing CC Pro private members community with regular events, networking and support. Plus, you'll get full access to our growing library of career-boosting resources, guides and templates. And best of all, it only costs a few dollars, euros or pounds per month to join the Academy. Now, to find out more, please visit conservation-careers.com/academy, or simply click the join button at the top of our website. See you on the inside.